at our Faculty of World Economy and International Affairs. And I would like to start today's seminar with a piece of sad news. It is in fact with enormous sadness that I have to let you know that Professor Ezra Vogel, who did our first seminar of this series, first Eurasian seminar, he passed away, unfortunately, at the age of 90 on 20th of December in Cambridge, Massachusetts, US. So we wanted to honor his memory. He was emeritus professor of Harvard University, held various positions there, and in press, they say that he served as a bridge between East Asia and the United States, examining the rise of two superpowers, Japan and China. He wrote numerous books, and he is very well known to all of us. So we are very sad to say that, but at the same time, very honored that he honored us with his participation in one of our seminars, in the first seminar. Moving on to the topic of our today's seminar, the Department of International Relations and International Laboratory on World Order Studies and the New Regionalism, in cooperation with the School of Oriental Studies of the National Research University High School of Economics, is holding the 24th joint session of Eurasian Online Seminar and China Seminar. Our guest today is a renowned US expert on international relations in Eurasia, Professor Charles Ziegler. The topic of his talk is US reactions to the China-Russian partnership. Charles Ziegler is professor and university scholar at the University of Louisville in Kentucky. He is also director of Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order. Professor Ziegler received his Ph.D. in political science from University of Illinois. He worked as senior Fulbright scholar at the Department of Political Science and Diplomacy in Pusan National University in Republic of Korea, and a research associate at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. He was also a national fellow at Hoover Institution of Stanford University. His major teaching and research interests are international relations, foreign policy, comparative politics, security, Russian foreign policy and domestic politics, East Asia, Central Asia, and democratization in Asia. Professor Ziegler has authored and edited several books, as well as numerous articles in top academic journals. His most recent books include Civil Society and Politics in Central Asia. This is from 2015. The History of Russia, Revised and Expanded Edition. This is from 2009. And The Russian Far East, A Region at Risk, 2002. Professor Ziegler, we are very honored to have you here today. Just want to say a few words about the format of the seminar. To those of you who are familiar, if you'd like to participate in the Q&A session, please specify. So in the chat, write down your name, your affiliation if you'd like, and your question in the chat, and we'll pick you during the Q&A session, which is probably going to be done by Alexander today. And we would also very much urge you to use your real names because otherwise we won't be able to, to call you out, introduce you properly, or even admit you to this conference. Right, thank you so much. So we're honored to have you here, Professor Ziegler, and the floor is yours. We very much look forward to what you have to say.
Okay, well, thank you, Olga, and thanks to Professor Lukien for inviting me to this. You have a very distinguished roster of scholars for the seminars, and it's sad to see that your first presenter, Professor Vogel, is no longer with us. What I'm going to do today is try to get a discussion going about where we think the new incoming Biden administration may go in its approach to Russia and China. And the point is that there's a great deal of concern or interest in the US security and defense establishment about Russian and Chinese cooperation against the United States. The incoming Biden administration, it seems, will prioritize great power competition with Russia and China, seeing these as the greatest security threats to the United States. This is similar to what we saw during the Trump administration. Rogue states like Iran and North Korea will probably be second on the list of priorities, and then terrorism will be third. I think also similar to the Trump administration, China will likely be perceived as more important to the US than Russia. But I think there's also a view that the close partnership between the two will act in a way as a force multiplier that will make China even more problematic for the United States. One thing I would caution you about, though, and that is that I think foreign policy, although Mr. Biden is definitely interested in it, it will be less significant than domestic issues because the US has a raft of internal problems that we need to deal with first. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic is at the very top. Restoring the economy, economic health, and dealing with economic inequality is a second major domestic issue. Addressing race relations, you know, about the problems we've had, the Black Lives Matter movement and so on throughout the year. There's going to be more attention to that. And then finally, dealing with climate change. So those are the four top priorities which are listed currently on the website, the Biden-Harris website. So the point is we need to get America's house in order if we're going to position the country to compete more effectively globally and to be stronger in order to deter adversaries. In foreign policy, though, there will be significant differences between the Trump and Biden administrations, and I think that's going to be in substance and not just in tone. The Biden administration will be likely to be more consistent in its policy, first of all, toward both Russia and China. You won't see the dramatic fluctuations which seem to have been driven by Mr. Trump's rather erratic personality. I think the administration will try to rebuild frayed ties with US allies in Europe, in particular in NATO, and in the Indo-Pacific with Japan and South Korea. It will prioritize diplomatic approaches over purely military instruments of foreign policy. That will be a major difference, I think. And we may see greater investment in the State Department, assuming that is that Congress will fund it. It's always more popular within the Congress to fund defense, the Department of Defense, rather than the State Department, which really doesn't have that much of a lobby. So what I want to do now is look at three dimensions of the Russian-Chinese partnership and address each of those in turn. They are the political, economic, and security dimensions, and try to sort of tease out how I think the US government is going to react to these. So if we start looking at the political dimension of the partnership. So China and Russia, of course, consider themselves great powers. And there's agreement in both capitals to cooperate to limit or constrain America's ability to dominate international relations and to challenge their sovereignty. Moscow and Beijing are both committed to multipolarity and a spheres of interest approach, where each state then can regulate its periphery without US interference. I think this close partnership, and I would certainly like to hear from the guests here, but I believe that this will continue as long as Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin remain in office. That will probably be for a while, but I would imagine the partnership's durable enough to survive if either or both of these leaders steps down or dies. I see each country as acting as a pragmatic nationalist great power, and each sees its interests as far more compatible with the other than with the United States. And I think much of Washington sees it from the same perspective. So let's look at some of the major regions in turn and see what we can expect from the Biden administration. Starting with Europe, Biden is a committed Atlanticist, as are his advisors. And I think he's going to start out right away in trying to reduce tensions with America's European allies and work more from a position of mutual respect. It also seems like the European leaders are very much looking forward to working with Biden rather than Trump. I think Biden, though, is going to use the occasion to, again, press NATO members to adhere to the 2% of GDP goal for defense expenditures. So that may be a source of friction, particularly with Germany, as might be the Nord Stream 2 project. But overall, the Biden administration, I think, will try to reduce tensions on trade, but again, at the same time, to seek some better deals for the United States. There is, of course, a lot of pressure from the left wing of the Democratic Party, which, interestingly enough, has a coincidence of interests which with much of the right wing of the Republican Party, in that they're skeptical on the benefits of trade. So this may be something that will be difficult for Biden to deal with. He's also going to cooperate with Europeans more on climate change. This will be a big difference, and I would expect that we will rejoin the Paris Accords. And regarding the partnership, I think we can expect to see efforts between the US and its European allies to form a stronger united front against China and Russia, sort of a coalition of democracies, though, again, certain members of European alliance may differ with the US in approaches to Russia and China. Biden also, I think, is a very strong supporter of Ukraine, and so that will continue to be an issue, in particular between US-Russia relations. Turning to the Middle East, this is an area where I think over the past few years, the US has lost a great deal of influence. And so a big question is, will Biden seek to restore American influence? Now, it wasn't just Mr. Trump. Obama himself was, I think, tired of the Middle East conflicts. That was part of the idea of the US pivot toward the Pacific. And I think in the US overall, there's a bit of frustration with and I think exhaustion with the problems of the Middle East. The retreat, if you will, in the later Obama years and Trump years means that the Middle East has offered major opportunities for both Russia and China, which have taken advantage of that. I think their position is stronger after Trump withdrew from the JCPOA. And they've taken advantage of that situation by negotiating closer military and economic cooperation with Tehran. It's interesting that China became the region's largest investor in 2016, and then, of course, established its first overseas base in Djibouti the following year. Russia has made similar gains within Syria, across North Africa and the Middle East. It's got this new base in Sudan to go along with the one in Syria, and is engaged in selling weapons to many of the countries in the Middle East and North Africa. So the question is there again, will the US try to get back into the Middle East in a big way, or will it stay out of it? If we turn to Latin America, I think we're going to see a big difference again between the Trump and Biden administrations. Trump basically ignored the region, with the exception of the renegotiations of NAFTA, which did not do much more than really modernize the agreement. It didn't change it all that much. His condemnations of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, praise for Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. But other than that, the administration didn't really do much in Latin America. And again, this opened up avenues for both Russia and China, which I think it's not seen that they are pursuing a common agenda. They each have their separate agendas there. Russia sells arms, includes energy deals. China, again, has been more active with its imports of commodities, investments in infrastructure, cultural exchanges, loans, providing loans and equipment, especially recently equipment to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. And both have supported governments that have testy relations with the US, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and have sought to erode American influence in the hemisphere. Biden has made many trips over the years to Latin America. He's got close relations with leaders both in Central America and in the Southern Cone. It's likely he will reverse or modify Trump's positions on immigration. He's also likely to provide more support for Central American countries to help build up their economies so that we don't see the pressure of immigration to the US. And he'll probably revert to the more cooperative position on Cuba that President Obama started. On Venezuela, a bit of a question mark there. I would imagine we'll see continued pressure on the Maduro government. One possibility for cooperation here with China and Russia would be to possibly get them to cooperate with the US on addressing the deep economic problems, which certainly would mean getting Maduro out of office and getting someone somewhat more competent in there than him. Also, I would imagine we'll see a greater criticism of Brazil's leader, Bolsonaro, in particular with relation to the destruction of the Amazon. In South Asia, I think the US will continue to strengthen the partnership with an independent-minded India. Russia, of course, is also trying to rebuild the relationship that it had for so many years during the Soviet period. The US recognizes, I think, that this has the potential to increase tensions between Moscow and Beijing. There's not really that much of a chance of a Russia, China, India triangle, as Primakov used to propose to counterbalance the US. This policy actually goes back to the middle of the Bush II administration. And I think the US under a Biden administration is going to continue to conceptualize Asia Pacific more as the Indo-Pacific, and again, bring India in as a democratic partner along with Australia and South Korea, Japan. On the issue of Russian sales to India, I don't know if the Biden administration will make that much of a deal of it. Again, we'll just have to wait and see on that. If we turn to Africa, this is, again, an area that Mr. Trump basically ignored and denigrated, if you recall. China certainly has, and there's much discussion in Washington about how China has supplanted the United States in Africa with its investments and trade interests. And it certainly has far more leverage on the continent than Russia does. But there again, Russian and Chinese activities, even if not coordinated, pose a challenge to US presence and influence on the continent. Certainly Biden is going to show greater respect to the African countries than Mr. Trump did. He's going to be, I would think, more welcoming of refugees from Africa, more positive toward the African diaspora in the US. The big question there is whether the US will actually try to compete with China in Africa, and will it have the resources to do so? Power transition theory would suggest to us that rising China is likely to challenge the US for global hegemony, and that could result in armed conflict, which could be over Taiwan or over some issue in the South China Sea. And if this occurs, the consensus in Washington seems to be that it would be unlikely that Russia would back China militarily. It also seems unlikely that China would actively support Russia in the event of some kind of conflict in Europe, say in the Baltic states or Ukraine. However, if one conflict breaks out in one region, Washington then would be hard-pressed to deal with a conflict in a second. That is a major concern. Not necessarily a two-front war, but a two-front conflict, which may be hybrid in its characteristics. Again, a key strength for the US, however, that neither Russia nor China has is the network of alliances, both in the Europe and the Pacific. And certainly all indications are the Biden administration is going to strengthen America's ability to respond to challenges in these two regions by working on its alliances. Finally, under politics, turning to the issue of the liberal international order, Trump basically rejected the idea of it. His notion of America first was more America alone and rejection of international institutions. I think the Biden administration, well, definitely will reinvigorate America's support for liberal internationalism. And this means support for international organizations like the UN, the World Health Organization, and others that Trump either neglected or withdrew from. His administration also, I would suggest, will, if not prioritize, at least put greater emphasis on human rights and democracy promotion, both of which are strongly opposed by both Moscow and Beijing. Does this mean humanitarian intervention? I doubt that. I think the tide has turned against the sort of intervention that we saw, say, in 2011 in Libya. All right, let's turn to economic cooperation, Russian and Chinese cooperation, and Washington's reaction to it. Clearly, Russia and China are close economic partners. The economic relationship has expanded in recent years, and it looks like it's going to continue to grow. I'm not sure it will actually hit the $200 billion anytime soon that's discussed, especially as long as oil prices remain low. There are clear complementarities in the relationship, but Russia, if you look at statistics, is far more dependent economically on China than the reverse. The oil and gas pipeline networks, once those are in place, and most of it is, that's going to create a web of interdependence. And again, the energy relationship is considered in Washington, although I think, again, there are mixed views on this, some seeing this as creating a sort of Chinese dependence on Russia, others saying, no, it's not all that significant. Washington's reaction to the Belt and Road Initiative is also somewhat mixed, and it's not clear what this might be under Biden. The people who are advising him may see it as a threat, which is pretty much how the Trump administration saw it. Others suggest that Chinese investments in infrastructure through Central Asia or into Eastern Europe or in Southeast Asia are not necessarily a threat to US interests. Competition in the Arctic is a major concern for Washington, however, and people in Washington are watching this very closely. I think the idea is that Russia and China will be partners in the Arctic, although there will be some tensions there. I believe that the US would like to compete with this, but as you may know, the US has nowhere near the number of icebreakers that Russia has. Russia has 40 or more. The US has only 2, neither of which is in very good shape. And so again, this is an area where the US has clearly slipped in recent years. So will the US try to rebuild its influence in the Arctic? If it cares to do so, that's an expensive proposition and will probably be limited by, again, domestic and other economic considerations. A couple of other issues related to economics, the issue of dollar dominance. I know Beijing and Moscow have talked about getting away from the diktat of the dollar in the global economy. They're using more and more barter arrangements or using Chinese currencies, but the US dollar still accounts for 80% of all global transactions. And so it's not likely that the dollar will be undermined anytime in the near future. And then finally, a very important dimension of economic statecraft, and that is sanctions. Sanctions have been ramped up even under the Trump administration, which was very interesting. I wrote a paper on this. Sanctions in large part under the Trump administration were driven by Congress. And even going back into the into the Obama administration, it was the same thing. We see a lot of pressure here. Congress likes to use sanctions to punish countries. The new defense bill, for example, has sanctions against Turkey for the import of the S-400 anti-missile systems. And again, indications are that the Biden administration will probably go even further than the Trump administration did in imposing sanctions, both against China and Russia. And it, in this case, may be more on the same page as Congress, which was not always the case. Trump often resisted the imposition of sanctions, in particular against Russia. But I think you're going to see, again, a more consistent policy here on the imposition of sanctions on both countries, in addition to others, such as perhaps North Korea, Iran, Turkey, and maybe Venezuela. Turning to the third dimension, security cooperation, the imposition of US sanctions and the confrontational posturing, in particular Trump's trade war with China, I think have encouraged stronger cooperation between Russia and China. And much of this has been on defense and security issues, including arms sales, regular joint military exercises between the two, naval maneuvers, which challenge US freedom of navigation. And I know that policymakers in Washington are concerned that this cooperation could evolve into a full-blown formal military alliance. I would be interested in hearing, especially from my Russian friends, whether or not they think the conclusion of a formal defense treaty would be likely between Russia and China in the near future. I don't personally see it. I think each side wants to keep their options open. Neither wants to be dragged into a conflict that's not in their national interest. But of course, Mr. Putin said at the most recent Valdai Discussion Club that a formal military alliance, it wasn't needed at present, but he said it could not be ruled out in the future. And that did get the attention of folks in Washington. And a very important point is that even without a formal military alliance, the two countries have this close partnership that involves expanding trade, arms sales, military exercises, intelligence sharing, and that in effect poses a challenge to the United States. So Russia doesn't really have the military capability to take on the US in the Indo-Pacific. China does not have the capability to take on the US in Europe. Each is a regional power, but each regards the US as their chief competitor. And the strategic partnership, I would suggest, is a balancing. It balances US military power, which constrains what the US can do in Eastern Europe and in the Western Pacific, even if there is not a formal military alliance here. And as I mentioned earlier, I think the US would be ill prepared to deal with regional challenges from both powers simultaneously. It's also, I think, the partnership, as Washington sees it, frees up each country to be more aggressive. That China doesn't face a land threat in its backyard, so to speak, and Russia does not have to worry about any threats from the Far East, as it has over so many decades. And so each then becomes free to pursue its interests more aggressively along the periphery and at sea. So the scenarios of conflict, either in the Western Pacific or in Europe, may not be that likely, but obviously they are within the realm of possibility. And defense planners, security planners in Washington are going to be considering every possibility. And as I said, I think this is recognized, it's not so much a matter of major conflict as it is potentially small, brief conflicts over, say, islands in the South China Sea, accidents with overflights or something like that, or hybrid forms of aggression that could bring the sides into conflict. On arms control, the Trump administration, particularly when John Bolton was in it, was not at all serious about arms control issues. The Biden administration will be more so. I would expect that we'll see an extension of New START. The two sides are going to have to work very quickly on that. I would also expect that the US will try to bring China into arms control negotiations, but to deal with China on a bilateral basis rather than to try to bring China in as the Trump administration did, which basically was a non-starter. The US is also concerned about technology cooperation between the US or between China and Russia. The smart sanctions they've imposed have often targeted these higher tech dimensions. And I think the fear is that China, given the progress it's made in 5G and surveillance capabilities and so on, can provide Russia with high-tech capabilities that would not have otherwise. And this then presents a challenge to the US, certainly with the recent hack that we saw of a number of US cabinet departments. That has really gotten Washington's attention, and it's something the Biden administration will have to deal with it. How they deal with it, they make threatening noises, but this is obviously an intelligence matter. It is traditional spying by new high-tech means. And although I don't know this area very well, it certainly seems to me like a good offense is better than always better than a good defense. And the most the US can do is simply try to improve its defenses. So why don't I give you the key takeaways from this, and then hopefully we can get into a good discussion of it. Washington recognizes that Russia and China have many common interests and that the areas where their interests clash are few and manageable. In other words, the strategic partnership is not likely to weaken over the next few years. It may well strengthen, though the chances are it's not going to lead to a full-blown military alliance. So this will remain a real area of concern for the United States going into the Biden administration. There's a great deal of discussion here too about the liberal international order. The U.S. has benefited greatly from having shaped the post-war international order and setting up the institutions, whether it was the UN, IMF, the World Bank, has basically served the country pretty well over the past 7 decades. As most of you probably know, there's huge pushback by foreign policy analysts against Trump's simply disparaging international institutions, and the Biden administration certainly, I think, will seek to restore America's leading position in much of the world. They'll rejoin the international institutions abandoned by Trump and work more closely with allies to counter both Russia and China. But as I mentioned, we have so many domestic issues to worry about. Resources have been stretched thin by COVID-19. Congress just approved another $900 billion bill to deal with COVID, which is going to put us even more deeply in debt. And if you combine that with the political dysfunction in Washington and deep divisions in America's political culture, these have all combined together, eroded America's soft power. Biden is certainly going to try to restore that soft power, but I think it's going to take a while. Another thing that I would expect is that we'll see a careful evaluation of U.S. obligations around the world. I doubt that we're going to see simply a reflexive reaction to challenges from Russia and China. The administration, I would think, will prioritize regions, and that not all Russian or Chinese actions, say in Africa or Southeast Asia or with the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, might be seen as harmful to U.S. interests. Having said that, the argument in some places, such as Quincy Institute and people like John Mearsheimer, that Washington needs to conduct a more restrained foreign policy in place of the liberal interventionism of the past 7 decades. I don't think that's going to get much traction in a Biden administration. I think the new administration will cooperate with both Russia and China where feasible, look for areas, in particular, things such as climate change, dealing with pandemics, terrorism, but most realize that a wedge strategy similar to that pursued during the Nixon administration is not very likely to succeed. So I think we'll see more of a nuanced and subtle strategy of engaging bilaterally where possible and trying to stand up again for U.S. interests where cooperation is not possible. I think we'll pursue more effective diplomacy, cultivate allies, and prioritize areas of competition, and we'll see greater pushback against human rights violations, cyber aggression, flouting of international norms, and unfair trade practices. So to conclude, I would admit that U.S. domestic politics have been in recent years dysfunctional, political culture deeply divided, and the economic system fundamentally unjust. The Trump administration's America First policy, however, undermined U.S. standing internationally by neglecting diplomacy and unnecessarily antagonizing the U.S.'s closest allies and partners. The Biden administration will seek to restore America's leading position in the world. Whether or not it can do that is a major question that I'm afraid I simply wouldn't have an answer to. So at that point, I think I will wrap it up and open the floor to questions. I look forward to your reactions and suggestions and questions.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to do the Q&A session, and please, those who have any questions, please write to the chat so we can see whom to call. And I'll use my administrative position to ask the first question, and that is that you spoke mostly about foreign policy, which is understandable, but it seems that the United States internally is becoming kind of more like two-party state, unlike it was before. It's pretty divided, and some questions, including foreign policy, and namely China and Russia, are becoming internal problems, and which may influence foreign policy quite significantly. For example, Russia was kind of whipping boy under Trump administration. Whenever Trump wanted to improve relations, he was immediately criticized by the Democrats, saying who said he was a traitor and he couldn't basically do anything. And he left it. And his policy, as a result, became even tougher than democratic policy. Well, now it seems that China is becoming such kind of whipping country, I would say, because we already can see that the Republicans are becoming beginning to criticize the Biden family for being like pro-Chinese and traitors because they wanted to do something with China. So do you think in this situation, any kind of reasonable policy or strategy is possible?
Well, I think you can have a reasonable policy, but it's going to be constrained. And you make a very good point. If you go back to the beginning of the second Bush administration, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, in a way, the US was looking for an enemy. And in the early part of 2001, you may have heard of the Blue Team of Republican advisors and specialists who saw China as the country that we really needed to go after as an external enemy. 9/11 hit, terrorism became, and terrorists and radical Muslim extremists became the enemy, and China was pushed to the back burner. As you really point out, rightly point out, with a divided political culture like we have, each party is going to seek external enemies to bolster its own political fortunes. The curious thing about the Trump administration was the Democrats became, if you will, more anti-Russian as a criticism of Trump. Within the Trump administration, you had people who were critical of Russia, but then you had a president who refused to say anything negative about either the country or about Mr. Putin himself, which was a bit strange. Kind of hard to figure that out. But you're right that whether it's Russia or China, foreign policy does or is intertwined with domestic politics. And so politicians are going to use what they see as a potential line of attack against their opponents. And I think the thing for Trump was he saw the entire world in economic terms. He never understood security issues. For him, everything was economics. Russia never posed any sort of economic threat to us because we do very little trade with Russia. Russia is not churning out consumer goods and electronics the way that China is. We don't have a huge trade deficit with China. And so I think for Trump, it was pretty easy. China was the enemy because of the imbalanced economic relationship. Not something that most economists would normally go along with. But for others, it's a mix of things. It may be security. And as you point out, each of these countries, and Iran too. I mean, you could add in Iran, you can add in North Korea as countries that, like you said, become whipping boys and actually are become far more important than they would be as any genuine security threat because it becomes politicized.
Right, thank you. Professor Karaganov has a question now. Professor Karaganov, could you turn on your microphone, please?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Ziegler, for your excellent expose. I have a question which is similar to Professor Lukin's, but looks from a different angle, the issue. Not from the internal angle, but from external. What you are describing and other thoughtful pundits do is a relatively consistent and reasonable, from American point of view, foreign policy. But that is foreign policy which of the 2000s and early 2010s, which brought United States into a situation by the mid of the previous the ending decade into a decline, where you were losing one issue after another, several interventions, several disgraces, crisis of the alliances. Anyway, I mean, it started during Obama and even during Bush. So what you are saying, let's do Obama second. But why do you think Obama second could be more effective under circumstances when the situation is far less favorable to the United States than it was 10 or 12 years ago?
Excellent question. And I would agree with you. I think Mr. Biden, as you know, is not all that young. And what that means is, I think his ideas have been formed. Doesn't mean he's not open to change, but I think he is a convinced internationalist. Will this be Obama 2? I think there will be elements of that. And did Mr. Biden learn lessons during that period, such as, humanitarian intervention doesn't always produce humanitarian results? Did he learn that you can't easily or simply promote democracies in countries, that they need to work that out themselves internally? I mean, John Stuart Mill made that point 150 years ago. If it's imposed from outside, it's not really democracy. I've studied democracy and democratization quite a bit. It's not easy to build democracy, but Americans still have this sort of idealistic notion that they can do it easily, and that leads to these sorts of interventions. You might see a more sophisticated approach to that, understanding that you can't simply do it the way the Bush 2 administration did, go into Iraq, invade the country, destroy a good chunk of it, and then hope to build, a modern democracy in the Middle East out of it. I would hope they've learned some of those lessons. I think they have. I think Mr. Obama understood a good part of that and was reluctant to try to promote democracy in these regions. That was part of his frustration with the Middle East. But my one point was that I don't think you're going to find many people in this administration, the upcoming one, who are going to buy into the arguments. I mentioned John Mearsheimer, Barry Pusan at MIT, the other people in, say, the Quincy Institute, who are arguing for a major pullback or a major retreat, so that the US is simply one of several great powers. Not that it becomes isolationist, but that it really picks and chooses its battles more carefully. I don't think they're going to go that far. So you're right in the sense that this will be something of an Obama 2 administration. It just remains to be seen how they operationalize that, if you will, how they actually bring these goals of, again, promoting democracy. Is it simply going to be through example? I think there's a good part of that the US should set an example rather than simply mucking around in other people's internal affairs. But the exact contours of it, I think we have yet to see how that'll play out.
I'll continue. I remember very well at the beginning of the Obama administration, and I have many friends there in and out, and I was quite enthusiastic about that administration, because actually what Obama at the beginning proposed, and people around him, was partial withdrawal and concentration on rebuilding United States. But he was not allowed, in a way, by the same elite which comes back. Then Trump did that in a very kinky way, let's put it this way. But the problem is there. United States has overextended itself. And what you are now saying is that they will be maneuvering, trying to rebuild the positions which have been long lost.
They may. As I said, I'm not sure how well that will work out. There are, going back to domestic pressures, though, that Professor Lukin brought up, I think that's a big part of it, though, that the US is not, well, a good part of the public does not want to see a lot of money spent on foreign adventures anymore. It's simply not popular. It's not popular much anymore with a good part of the Republican base that Trump has controlled. And it's not very popular with much of the Democratic Party's left wing. So that doesn't leave a very large base for sort of an active expansionist foreign policy. I think that will be a constraint on what this incoming administration tries to do. But the rhetoric is all of, again, reestablishing American leadership. Is that simply for public consumption? And then are they not really serious about it? Hard to say. But I think that, again, I think they will be picking their battles a little more closely. I think Latin America will certainly be a priority. Europe will be a priority. The Indo-Pacific, that's a bit more of a question. And there, who knows? We could see a modus vivendi with China and some recognition that, yes, China has legitimate interests in the Western Pacific as a great power. China hasn't pursued those very skillfully, but that we should at least recognize that and deal with it. Hard to say, though. And again, the thing to watch there obviously would be Taiwan, and to what extent do we really ramp up support for Taiwan? Again, once again, the pressures are going to come, I believe, from Congress for that sort of thing. And there you would probably see it in both parties, Republicans and Democrats, using an issue like Taiwan to exert pressure on the administration.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. I like that you mentioned John Stuart Mill. I found a good quote from him.
Mm-hmm.
well, I'll quote, when the people are too much attached to savage independence to be tolerant of the amount of power to which it is for their good that they should be subject, the state or society is not yet ripe for representative government.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, I think that some people just are not deserve representative government because they are not ready for it. That's a very interesting quote. But we have a question now from Gung Enze, who says that he was a student at our university and he's from China.
Mm-hmm.
Are you here? Do you want to ask a question yourself?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, hello, Professor Lukin, hello, Professor Ziegler.
I hope you're not in China now because it's pretty.
I am in China.
Oh, so it's 11 in the evening.
Yeah, it's in the evening, and actually I'm from the city of Wuhan, so it's quite interesting place, especially during the earlier part of this year.
Okay.
Yeah. Since I actually went to the university college in the US and I graduate my graduate program in Russia. So I speak both Russian and English, and that makes me very interested in the affairs in the triangle between China, Russia, and the US. So my question is that whether do you think that it is practical for Russia to benefit as a undecided chess on the chessboard between the competition of US and China? Because there are many theories that China may benefit, but it is practical or not practical. Will Washington allow it, or what's your opinion on that?
Well, whether or not Washington will allow it, I don't think Washington really has that much power to have a say over. I assume you mean allow certain elements of the Russian-Chinese partnership. There's not really much Washington can do about it. I think that was a thrust of my presentation, that there's a recognition in Washington that the partnership is very important for the US. The focus tends to be on China because, again, China is a much more powerful economy. It is rapidly developing its military capabilities, and that Russia is a different actor, more powerful militarily, but far weaker economically. But together, the two, act as force multipliers. But the question is, what can the U.S. do about it? And as I sketched out, I think that the most the U.S. can do is first to restore its own economic health, its own standing in the world, which was greatly damaged by Mr. Trump, restore its soft power, and seek to cooperate with each country bilaterally in areas where they have common interests. And those may not be a large number of interests where they have those in common, but they need to sort those out and find those. And finally, just let me thank you for staying up that late to listen to my presentation. I appreciate it.
Right. Thank you very much. We come back to Russia now. Dr. Andrei Dikaryov has a question. Where are you?
Oh.
Okay.
Good evening to everybody. Sorry, I don't have camera on my computer. I would like to thank Mr. Ziegler for his generous presentation. I would say he made a lot of predictions, which I hope all of us will live and see if they come true or not. Now I have a very short question just about, do you see any substantial difference within Biden administration towards Venezuela and Cuba? What is the difference, if any?
Israel and Cuba?
Venezuela and Cuba.
Venezuela and Cuba. I think on Cuba, we're probably going to go back to seeing the sort of relationship that we had under Obama, and that is trying to build relations. I know I went to several meetings with business people who are really enthusiastic about normalization of relations with Cuba. And I think they've been really disappointed by the Trump administration tightening up the screws. So I think we'll see a real liberalization of policy here. The sticker on that is this question of what happened to diplomats and intelligence agents in the embassy in Havana. The use of microwaves, which apparently is, as far as we can tell, Russian technology, and that a number of them became sick. So what was going on there, it's not clear whether that was a faction in the Cuban leadership that was trying to submarine the rapprochement between our two countries. But I think we'll see improved relations. On Venezuela, Biden's not going to threaten an empty threat the way that Trump did about using military force against Venezuela. That's not going to happen. But I think we'll continue to see pressure on the Maduro government there. I think we'll see much more, again, working with our friends in the region, working with Colombia in particular, and Argentina and others to put pressure. And as I said, it would be interesting to see if the administration will reach out to China and Russia and try to enlist their support. Because, the Venezuelan people are just living in a basket case of a country right now. Even if you respect a country's right to handle its internal affairs, you've got huge millions of refugees, you've got poverty, you've got health care issues, and all of that has spillover effects to the region. So it really is something that needs to be dealt with. And I would hope that the responsible people in Moscow and Beijing can understand that something needs to be done to address that issue. It may not be regime change, but it certainly poor people of Venezuela deserve something a little better than what they have right now. I hope that answers your question.
All right, thanks very much. Now we have a question from Dr. Vitaly Yermakov. Please.
Hello. Professor Ziegler, thanks for your lecture. My question is, why? It seems to me that in the United States, there was this widespread conviction that a long-lasting alliance between Russia and China is impossible. At least that was the view during most of the past decade. Do you agree with this, first? And second, now that this characterization appears as a strategic blunder, why so many people were convinced in this and why they were so wrong?
Oh, that is, to be honest, that's a difficult question. Some of that may have been wishful thinking, and it may have been tied to the idea that China would eventually, because of its economic liberalization, because of the openness now, the society, so many Chinese studying in Western countries and in Europe and Australia and the US and wherever, that China would evolve not toward liberal democracy really, but toward a more open political structure. I think the real wake-up call has come in recent years, seeing that Xi Jinping has been almost Maoist in his orientation toward governing, much more hardline than his predecessors. The fact that he ended the two-term rule, and the crackdown on Uyghurs in Xinjiang, what's happened in Hong Kong, I think all of this brought home the point that China, at least politically, is not really going to evolve anytime in the near future. And so that, I think, drove home the point that then China and Russia, the partnership seems to be a partnership of like-mindedness, and that is a rejection of liberal democracy, in addition to a rejection of US unilateralism. That, I think, is probably the best explanation for why that came about. Very good question.
Right. Now we have a question from Kirill Likhachov. We need to.
Yeah, hello.
Yes, go ahead.
Dr. Ziegler, thank you for your presentation. I have a short question, and it is dedicated to policy of the Biden's administration and future relations with India in case if Biden's administration chooses a more tough policy towards China. And do you think that in such conditions, it may imply that the US could choose such steps that could lead to further rapprochement with India in the coming years? Thank you.
That let me make sure I understand you straight, that it could lead to greater rapprochement between the US and India, or something else? Okay. So I think India will be a priority for several reasons. One, in international relations terms, simply because, again, India for the US is a balancer against China. And given the recent border conflicts they've had, it doesn't look like China and India are going to have a rapprochement anytime soon. Another factor that I would stress, and you might not think of, is the fact that we have a large number of Indian immigrants in the United States, and they're becoming increasingly important in American society. Now, a lot of those are doctors and engineers, but I think if you look at our politics, you're seeing more and more, look at our vice president elect, you're seeing more and more Indians who are influential in politics. And so there is, I think, a stronger, in a way, cultural affinity there between the two. So you've got, on the one hand, a strategic consideration that is driving our country together with India, and you also have this domestic connection. Now, the thing about India, though, and I'm not a specialist on India, but I know a number of people who are, and one thing about India is they are extremely jealous of their sovereignty, their independence. We've seen in the past, they've broken with the United States on issues like humanitarian intervention, R2P, questions like that. And so that I think is going to be a factor. It's not, India is not going to be a close ally of the United States. I think they will be a good partner, but the Indians, as far as I can tell, seem to be very independent-minded, and will only go so far in aligning with the US. Excellent questions. Do we have some others?
Professor Lukin?
think Professor Lukin may have left.
So please.
No, sorry. Yes, that we have a question. No, there was something with my microphone. Well, the next question is from, and I think it's the last question actually, is from Dr. Kirill Barsky. Dr. Barsky, please go ahead.
Thank you
Oh,
for a fascinating presentation. You put a special stress on challenges allegedly coming from China and Russia to the United States, and this is understandable. But you also mentioned that there is a possibility of cooperation between the US, China, and Russia on issues like the terrorism and climate change. What are the possible areas of cooperation in your mind? For example, can Afghanistan be an issue where the United States under the Biden administration may need Russian and Chinese cooperation? To arrange peace in Afghanistan after the withdrawal of the United States, America would probably be interested in stability and development in the neighboring countries like Pakistan or Central Asia. Is there a possibility that the Biden administration will be pragmatic enough to work with Russia and China on peace and stability and development in this region, or building north-south corridor with its transportation routes and pipelines and so on? It may be also an area where the three countries can cooperate. We all hope that the United States will rejoin JCPOA, and in this case, probably constructive engagement of Iran may be also an area of cooperation. And how about a liberalization of trade in the Asia Pacific? Is there a possibility that the United States will get back to Trans-Pacific Partnership? We've heard that China expressed its willingness to consider a possibility of joining TPP at one point. Another grouping where Russia, China, and the United States can work together is APEC. How about these possibilities? Thank you very much.
All right, well, that's a long list of possibilities. Of those, I think, areas for potential cooperation, the best, Afghanistan you mentioned. I think Afghanistan has been, under the Trump administration, pretty much a disaster. We've heard recently continued bombings over there. The Taliban are, if anything, stronger than they were several years back. I'm not sure how helpful China would be on Afghanistan. My perception of that, although those of you who specialize more in China than I do might correct me, but my perception is the Chinese simply want to be able to perhaps extract raw materials, although they do have an interest in keeping the country stable. I think there Russia would be a more likely partner, and it has been, Moscow has been interested in trying to broker a deal there. But I would hope we could cooperate on Afghanistan, because otherwise we may see the country go back to where it was in the mid-1990s. And that would be a disaster after the US having spent nearly 20 years in that country. The other that I think is very important would be on the Iran nuclear deal. I don't believe that the US is simply going to come back and rejoin it. I think that the Biden administration will probably try to extract more leverage on Tehran to address some of the other things that Iran's been doing around the Middle East. And I think in that, we're going to have a number of partners among the Sunni states in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia. And so there, I think there is potential, some potential for cooperation. But much depends on whether or not Russia and China perceive Iran as a major way to weaken the U.S. in the Middle East, or if they're willing to cooperate on that. I mean, both have significant interests in Iran. So I guess I'm less sanguine about the possibilities there. On trade issues, Biden's, again, politically, Biden is going to have trouble simply going back into the TPP in the way it's been reconstituted, led by Japan. That is probably going to take a while. I don't see that as something he's immediately going to deal with. That may be in, say, the second year of the administration. But I think we will be talking to, the countries who are involved in that. Bringing China into it is, I think, less likely. The original idea under the Obama administration was to create liberal rules of trade that China either would not accept, or if they accepted, the rules would significantly change the game for China. So we could see if China would be interested in playing along with that. I'm not certain. So those I see as major areas. I would also mention arms control. I think there's a very worrying arms race going on now. Technology, I did an article on that for the Texas National Security Review about a security dilemma in US-Russia arms competition. So there, I would hope that we could cooperate, as I said, maybe not trilaterally, but at least on a bilateral basis with both Russia to get these weapons systems under control, to have better communication. I think one of the most worrying things is that so many of even the Cold War lines of communication that we established are just not there anymore. And that makes the possibility of accidents much greater. I think we should restart those, and we should work with China to try to, if we can, get some controls on their military buildup. So I know I haven't addressed all those, but there's quite a bit there, and I hit on the ones that I think are most important. I'd simply close by saying on transportation corridors in Central Asia, still don't have any indication of what might happen there. The Trump administration had talked about new programs in Central Asia. My view is basically, and particularly after we extricate ourselves from Afghanistan, Central Asia is going to be pretty low on US priority list. But thank you for those questions.
Well, thank you very much. It was a great talk and discussion. I don't see any questions, any more questions. So let's thank Professor Ziegler. And he gave us a very pretty comprehensive picture about what Biden's policy might be. Let's wait and see if he's going to listen to us. And because American policies sometimes is pretty unexpected, like Nixon was pretty anti-Chinese, but then he suddenly improved relations with China. Reagan was pretty anti-Soviet, and he signed many important agreements with the Soviet Union. Obama began with a reset and ended up with sanctions, so you never know what's going to happen. But it's still interesting to predict and analyze the trends. And we thank thank Professor Ziegler once again and hope to see him here in Moscow in person sometime when all this pandemic disaster ends, or maybe in the United States. Thank you very much. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, and hope to see you soon. Okay, bye-bye.
Goodbye.